When we think about mental health in today's world and the growing number of things that are contributing to a lot of the issues, the problems surrounding mental health, including things like anxiety, depression, even despair, we tend to constantly look for new solutions, new methods, strategies, medications, apps as a novel way to resolve some of these mental health difficulties that a lot of us and a lot of younger people are facing. But an odd thing that occurs as a result of our being on the frontier of medical innovation and scientific discovery and technological advancement, we tend to think that alongside those developments, we are also going to have better and better, increasingly efficient tools for combating the things we see, such as mental health and mental illness. And it's amazing to live in a time where we get to watch all of these amazing innovations unfold. But there's a danger that arises in a time like this when it comes to historical knowledge, or what some might even call esoteric knowledge. And when we look at and start to read a philosopher similar to Soren Kierkegaard, a 19th century writer and theologian, we tend to immediately get turned away by the type of language, the ancient form of prose, and the seemingly unnecessarily intellectual style of writing that he tends to use. And you might be correct in saying that Kierkegaard's style is a big roadblock, a big obstacle to many people getting into and enjoying his work because he is difficult to read. However, within Kierkegaard's work, despite being almost 200 years old, and within some of the smallest, most concise and consolidated works that he has put together, there are pieces, there are slivers of this aforementioned knowledge that have essentially been lost in today's landscape. And they've absolutely been lost in terms of new perspectives and new lenses when it comes to dealing with things like mental health, anxiety, depression, and despair, which Soren Kierkegaard touches on specifically. However, there is one book of his, namely The Lily of the Field and the Bird of the Air, which he calls the Three Godly Discourses. It's an incredibly small book, just over 100 pages, written in 1848. And this book, it's a strange book and it's a different book because it's essentially like a theological commentary on nature. And so the book is split into three parts, which Kierkegaard coins his three lessons or discourses. And despite each point being relatively short, relatively simple, and perhaps even intuitive for a lot of people who might be watching, when you take a step back, look at his philosophy, as simple as it is, put it all together, the implication of what that means and how it can be implemented into your daily life is something that would necessarily be very useful for people today looking for new or different perspectives in helping deal with something like anxiety. And so we start with the first lesson: silence. Look at the birds of the air. Consider the lily of the field, Kierkegaard says. This scripture is taken from the Gospel of Matthew, and Kierkegaard rests his entire discourse on the parable in chapter 6 from the Sermon on the Mount. What does this mean to be silent? Obviously, we know what it means to be silent, but what does it mean in Kierkegaard's context, in the context of the Sermon on the Mount? Well, if there's one thing we're not good at doing, it's being silent. Humans tend to always want to project themselves onto the world, to express reality as they see it, and to meet that expression with others. But something that doesn't come as natural, something that doesn't occur to us as being useful, is Well, the act of absolute silence. But this silence means much more than just not speaking. This silence is a silence of the mind. It's a form of observation. It's a way to view the world. And it's a more humbling way to view the world. It is an embodiment of the fact that we are all fallible. So the very act of us speaking, of trying to apprehend reality or communicate it in any way, is necessarily insufficient, even if it has allowed us to do a number of incredible things. As individuals and as a society, it's still insufficient. And the only way to truly get at the value of observing things around you is to be silent. And it's a really simple, it's a really, really subtle principle. But if you think about what that looks like in your life and what that looks like for how you can engage the world differently, it really is profound how much noise you can turn into observational silence. And so, this first lesson, Kierkegaard extends directly into the second lesson, which is obedience. And for this point, he quotes, "No one can serve two masters, for he must either hate the one and love the other, or hold fast to one and despise the other." In order to be obedient, Kierkegaard says, you must first be silent. Silence is an a priori requirement for obedience, and one extends out from the other by necessity. In submitting to God, he explains, you are humbling yourself before God, and you are taking a place that is more appropriate for you within the creative order, which is that of full submission. And we can step out of the theological interpretation for a second and ask ourselves if there's a way to view Kierkegaard's words that might have a more direct, a more useful relevancy in light of a modern engagement with reality. If you want to do that, you might look at this obedience through the lens of nature, or through the lens of the logos, the created order, the pre-existing order which has dictated your existence and will dictate your death. You can see it as obedience to objective reality, the constraints of reality, and you can see obedience as an adherence to that state, an admission of submission, if you will, the embodiment of your being less than that which you are a part of. And that is what can be interpreted from obedience in a way that is more than just a theological representation. What Kierkegaard is doing is he is not only aiming to explain these things and these phenomenon in the theological domain, he's looking at a more unified analysis, and through his theological interpretation is actually touching on some of the underlying truths of reality. And so when we look at obedience and what Kierkegaard would consider obedience to God and God's creative order, we can view that as acknowledging the constraints of reality and seeking to be content within them instead of constantly inventing these distractions for ourselves. And further reflecting Kierkegaard's analysis, this creative order, this logos, it will remain whether or not we individually choose to submit to it. So we recognize its objective nature and its constraints, and our choice will have no material difference. But it will align the self with the logos, and it will create the synergy that Kierkegaard would call the antidote to despair, which in other words is a spiritual or metaphysical dissonance. Of the birds and the lily, Kierkegaard writes this: they are so simple or so lofty that they believe everything that happens is unconditionally God's will, and that they have absolutely nothing to do in the world other than either to carry out God's will in unconditional obedience or submit to God's will in unconditional obedience. And so we similarly have an option. as we can submit to the creative order, we could submit to reality, or we can deny it and perpetually place ourselves in this state of dissonance. And further, in looking at the lily and the birds and comparing them to ourselves, we might ask what the actual difference is. And beyond just wanting to categorize it as intelligence, which may or may not be true, in reality, the main difference is that we tend to muddy the waters for ourselves and our observation of reality. We tend to think and analyze, and this carries us away from the truth of the present moment and hence away from the act of obedience. Because the prerequisite for this state of obedience has already been expressed through silence. And in this attempt to figure things out through our preconceived model of reality, we're necessarily rejecting obedience. We are again projecting our own desire to model reality onto reality. And so we will never reach the third step, the third lesson, and that is joy. Regarding joy, Kierkegaard writes this: "Look at the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, unconcerned about tomorrow. Consider the grass of the field, which today is." And what he'll tell you about this third lesson in joy is that it is not a goal nor a possession to be attained, yet it is the natural result of adherence to the first two lessons, that is, silent obedience. For if you are silently obedient, you will find joy. Joy is simple, joy is absolute, and Kierkegaard calls joy unconditional. And that is the key word here, unconditional, because how can a state of joy really be unconditional? We read that joy is to be present oneself, but truly to be present to oneself. Is this today? This to be today, truly to be today, joy is the present time, with the entire emphasis falling on the present time. Now, on the first, second, and third read through, the sentence might appear incoherent, a little bit redundant relative to the point that it's trying to make. But the point that it is trying to make, and the point that all of the other points have been leading up to, is this truth of joy, and joy being an unconditional state, an acceptance of reality. The key to this, the state of mind, is not found through knowledge. It's not found through discovering novel parts of the world. It's not found through experience. It's not found through transcendental wisdom. Joy is simply found in the present moment, in the present time. And that is what Kierkegaard is trying to say, is that we look everywhere except right in front of us, right at our front door. Our closest, our most intimate access to this thing we called objective reality, and Kierkegaard would call God, is the present moment. And within that comes all nature. This state of joy is communicative. It can be conveyed from one person to another solely by the act of observing another's joyfulness. And as mentioned before, by being silent, one can be obedient. And through this silent obedience, one naturally embodies joy. And that is the last tenet of this discourse. That is the final state. That requires no wealth. It requires no material wealth nor knowledge to attain. It just requires the perspective. The perspective may be deviating from one that you've heard or learned or adhered to growing up, that joy is something to be earned in life and to be found. It is a state that will come through an alignment with reality. And according to Kierkegaard, this alignment can be created through silence and obedience. And in relaying this point, Kierkegaard once again relies on the example, what he calls the teachers that are the birds and the lilies. As we've already observed their silence and their obedience, we naturally observe their joy. They never despair, and so they are always joyful. In birth, life, and death, the lily and the birds remain obedient. They understand their role in the creative order, and so for them, joy is abundant, even if us humans seem to have so much more to be joyful over. And so what he's encouraging is something that can be done without reservation. It can be as simple as a slight adjustment in perspective when it comes to these words we call silence and obedience and joy. And we pull this writing all the way from 1850, yet this is really a deeper representation of what a lot of people today would just call meditation. And they would call this act of obedience an act of meditation, the ritual of meditation. But now we've just secularized it and distilled the ritual into something that has lesser context. But even if it's something, even if that's the only thing that you benefit from, that you take away from a person like Kierkegaard, and knowing that no matter what, contentedness is accessible to you through true observation of the present moment, that's an incredibly valuable thing to know. That's an incredibly valuable thing to understand. And it cannot be nearly as well understood as much as it can be learned through embodiment. That's what Kierkegaard has left us with, and that's what I'm going to leave you with as a introduction to some of the philosophy that might not be so arbitrary, even in a completely different world.